The sun was a dying ember on the horizon, bleeding its last golden light across the long, lonely stretch of Route 29 just outside Charlottesville. It painted the asphalt in warm, melancholic hues, a deceptive serenity that belied the currents running beneath the surface of this quiet Virginia afternoon. The day was giving up, and in the gathering dusk, some things felt licensed to emerge. In the gravelly shoulder of the highway, a county patrol car sat like a dormant predator, its metallic hide reflecting the amber sky. Inside the vehicle, the world was reduced to the soft crackle of the police radio and the slow, measured rhythm of a man breathing. Officer Ted Marshall, a 20-year veteran of the force, occupied this space with a familiar, possessive ease. His hands, thick and calloused, rested on the steering wheel, not with idleness but with a patient, waiting tension. To the casual observer, to the passing families in their minivans, he was a symbol of safety, a sentinel. To the local community, or at least a significant portion of it, he was known by another unspoken reputation. Marshall was good police, in the words of the department brass. Vigilant, no nonsense. A man who didn't tolerate slick talk or cut corners. He cleaned up the highways, kept the trouble at bay. But on the streets where whispers carried further than official commendations, he had another name, a bulldog, a hunter. His patrol zone was his personal fiefdom, and his judgment was the only law that mattered in the moment between the flash of his lights and the uneasy exchange at the driver's window. It was a bias never written in a report, never admitted in a briefing, but etched into a pattern of behavior as clear as tire tracks on soft ground. Darker skin often meant a higher probability of a violation. A nicer car on a certain driver could read as suspicious rather than successful. He worked on a gut feeling, a deep-seated instinct he mistook for professional intuition. He scanned the road, his eyes, pale and flinty, missing nothing. A minivan passed obediently at the limit. An old truck puttered by. He dismissed them. He was waiting for the wrong note in the symphony of commuters, for the slightest ripple in the flow. His mind wasn't on public safety in the abstract. It was on the chase, the correction, the asserting of order, his order upon the world. He thought of his upcoming evaluation, the quiet commendation from his sergeant for his proactive numbers. He thought of the dinner waiting for him at home, the predictable silence of his house. This car, this stretch of road, was where he felt most alive, most powerful. Here, he was the first and last word, a flicker in the distance, a shape resolving from the shimmer of heat and light, a vehicle moving with a smooth, confident pace. It was a sleek black SUV, expensive but not flashy, the kind of car that spoke of money but didn't shout it. As it neared, his calibrated gaze dropped to his radar display. The digital numbers ticked up and settled just a hair over the speed limit. A mere 3 miles per hour. For anyone else, it might have been a warning, a slow down. For Marshall, it was a trigger. A slow, thin smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, not touching his eyes. It was the expression of a man who had just seen a puzzle piece click into place. The car, the speed, and as it drew closer, the driver. A glimpse through the windshield confirmed it, a young black man, his profile sharp, his gaze fixed ahead. "Gotcha," Marshall muttered to the stale air in his car, the word a soft exhale of satisfaction. This was it, the perfect trifecta, a violation, however minor. A vehicle that suggested the driver might have something to lose, making him more compliant or more nervous. and a demographic that in Marshall's private calculus warranted a closer look. This wasn't about the speed, not really. The speed was the key that unlocked the door. It was the legal justification to initiate the ritual, to exert control, to perform the theater of authority. He imagined the sequence, the lights, the startled look in the rear view, the obedient pull onto the shoulder. He imagined the approach, the window rolling down to reveal either fear or defiance. Both were currencies he knew how to trade in. His hand, almost of its own volition, reached for the control that would activate his light bar. The quiet afternoon was about to be shattered. He felt a familiar thrum of anticipation, a chemical rush of purpose. He was about to do his job as he saw it. He was about to correct a flaw in his world, to remind someone of their place in the hierarchy of this highway, in his hierarchy. He did not see a citizen. He did not see a human being with a story, a destination, a life. He saw a target, a subject, a problem to be managed. And as his finger hovered over the switch, Officer Ted Marshall, veteran, bulldog, hunter, took a final, calm breath in his kingdom of one, utterly convinced of his own righteousness, and utterly blind to the cataclysm that was already rolling toward him, cloaked in black steel and quiet dignity. The siren was a short, sharp bark in the afternoon stillness, a sound of pure authority, a command that brooked no argument. The pulsating red and blue lights fractured the golden hue on the asphalt, painting the scene in urgent, chaotic strokes. In Officer Marshall's practice sequence, it was the first move in a familiar chess game. He expected the usual reactions: a frantic glance in the rear view, a sudden, jerky swerve toward the shoulder, the visible slump of resignation in the driver's seat. The black SUV did none of that. It reacted with a smooth, almost preternatural calm. Its speed bled off evenly without a hint of panic braking. It guided itself onto the broad gravel shoulder with the precision of a luxury vehicle on a showroom floor, coming to a stop a respectful, legally perfect distance ahead of his cruiser. No drama, no haste, just compliance. It was wrong. It unsettled him. The lack of nervous energy felt to Marshall like a challenge in itself. He sat for a moment, a tactic he always used. Let them stew. Let the anxiety build. Let them fumble with their documents, their minds racing through whatever guilt or fear they carried. He watched the SUV in his mirror, its dark windows giving nothing back. 30 seconds passed. A minute. No door opened. No frantic reaching for the glove box. The vehicle just sat there, patient as a stone. A flicker of irritation cut through his routine. This wasn't how it went. He was the one who controlled the clock, the tension. With a grunt, he adjusted his duty belt, the heavy weight of his tools, the gun, the cuffs, the baton, a comforting anchor. He pushed open his door and stepped out into the waning light, his boots crunching authoritatively on the gravel. His approach was a performance of intimidation. He walked slowly, deliberately, his hand resting near his hip, his posture squared and broad. He focused his gaze on the driver's side mirror, aiming to catch the driver's eyes in it, to establish dominance before a single word was exchanged. But the mirror showed only a sliver of the interior, a dark recess. As he reached the rear quarter panel of the SUV, he did something habitual, almost superstitious. He raised his left hand and tapped the trunk lightly twice with his knuckles. Tap, tap. It was a sound meant to be heard inside, a jarring little announcement: I am here. This is real. It was also, though he'd never admit it, a way to leave a microscopic trace of his presence on the vehicle, a primal marking of his territory. He arrived at the driver's window. It was already rolling down, not with a jerky electric whir, but with a smooth, silent descent that spoke of impeccable engineering. And there he was. The young man behind the wheel turned his head to meet Marshall's gaze. He was younger than Marshall had guessed from a distance, perhaps in his early 30s, with a clean-shaven, composed face. He wore a tailored suit of a deep charcoal gray, the white of his dress shirt stark and crisp against it. A simple, elegant tie was knotted perfectly at his throat. He looked less like someone caught in a traffic stop and more like he was paused between important meetings. But it was his eyes that arrested Marshall. They held no fear, no defiance either. They were calm, observant, deeply intelligent pools of brown that took in the officer, the uniform, the entire scenario with a detached, analytical clarity. An air of innate, unshakable confidence seemed to radiate from him, as tangible as the scent of the leather interior. Marshall leaned down, planting his hands on the sill of the door, invading the man's space, using his bulk to loom. The interior of the car was cool and smelled faintly of sandalwood. License and registration. He barked the words, his voice sharp, stripped of any courtesy. It was a tone designed to startle, to command immediate, submissive obedience. The young man's expression didn't alter, not a twitch. He gave a single, slight nod, polite but not subservient, and turned smoothly to the center console. His movements were economical, graceful. He produced a slim, black leather wallet and a registration card from the glove box, handing them over without hesitation. His fingers didn't tremble. The documents were proffered neatly, presented, not surrendered. Marshall snatched them, his eyes already scanning. The license was pristine, the photo a perfect match. The name, Elijah Porter. The address was in an upscale neighborhood in Richmond. The registration was current, the vehicle owned by the same name. Everything was in impeccable order. This only deepened Marshall's suspicion. In his experience, perfect paperwork could be a facade. It felt too clean, too prepared. He looked from the license to the man's face, then back again, dragging out the silence. Finally, he spoke, his voice now laced with a condescending edge he couldn't suppress. "Do you know why I pulled you over, Mr. Porter?" He watched closely for the tells, the gulped swallow, the darting eyes, the nervous lick of the lips, the stammered excuse. Elijah Porter looked back at him, his gaze level. "I assume you'll tell me," he replied. His voice was even, respectful in its diction, but firm. It was a voice used to being heard, but it held no presumption. It was simply factual. The calm was infuriating. It was a wall Marshall didn't know how to scale. This man wasn't playing the game. He wasn't scared, he wasn't belligerent. He was just there. And his presence, his unassailable composure, began to feel to Marshall like a silent critique of the entire performance. Marshall's frown hardened into a scowl. The thin pretext of the stop now felt flimsy even to him, but he was committed. He had to assert control to crack this cool exterior. "You were speeding," he declared, the accusation hanging in the air between them, weak and hollow. Elijah Porter simply waited, offering no argument, no plea. His silence was more disconcerting than any protest. Frustration, hot and sudden, rose in Marshall's chest. He needed to change the dynamics to get this man out of his fortified position behind the wheel. "Step out of the vehicle," Marshall commanded, his tone leaving no room for question. "Please." For the first time, a reaction. The man's eyebrows lifted a fraction, a silent punctuation of surprise or curiosity, but it was gone in an instant. Without a word, he unfastened his seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped out onto the gravel. He unfolded himself from the driver's seat with a measured grace that was startling. He stood to his full height, which was nearly equal to Marshall's, and turned to face him. He didn't slump against the car. He stood tall, his hands relaxed at his sides, meeting Marshall's gaze directly. There was no fear in his eyes, no defiance. There was only a waiting, patient attention that felt, for the first time in 20 years on the job, profoundly dangerous. The dynamic had shifted the moment Elijah Porter's polished dress shoes met the gravel. He was no longer a face in a car, a target behind glass. He was a physical presence, solid and real, and his calmness now filled the space between them like a force field. Officer Marshall felt it immediately, a subtle but vital inversion. The ritual demanded a cowed subject, and this man was not cowed. The script was falling apart. Marshall circled him, a slow, predatory orbit. His eyes, narrowed to slits, swept over Elijah's impeccable suit, the sharp line of his jacket, the subtle gleam of his cufflinks. To Marshall, it was all costume, a performance of legitimacy. He'd seen it before, young guys in flashy clothes trying to buy respect they hadn't earned. This was just a more expensive version. "What brings you to this area, Mr. Porter?" Marshall asked, his voice deliberately casual, a deceptive softness that preceded the hammer. He wasn't looking at Elijah as he spoke. He was peering into the SUV's tinted windows, his flashlight beam cutting through the interior despite the ample daylight. He was looking for a reason, an open container, a suspicious bag, anything to justify the growing, gnawing feeling in his gut that this was spiraling away from him. "Work," Elijah replied. The single word was offered without elaboration, without the nervous urge to fill the silence that most people had. He stood with his hands folded loosely in front of him, a posture of patience, not submission. Marshall stopped his circling and turned to face him directly. The simple answer was a rebuke. It denied him the threads he usually pulled to unravel a story. "Where do you work? What kind of work? Who are you meeting?" This man was giving him nothing. "Work," Marshall echoed, the word dripping with sarcasm. "You dress like that for work." He gestured vaguely at the suit, his own uniform, the rumpled polyester, the utilitarian gear, suddenly feeling cheap and grubby in comparison. The comparison fueled his irritation. "For some work, yes," Elijah said, his tone still even. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, not of amusement but of a man observing a predictable pattern. It was that hint of a smile that did it. It was a spark to tinder. Marshall took a step closer, invading the man's personal space, trying to use his bulk to physically overshadow him. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, confrontational growl meant for just the two of them. "You seem awfully calm for someone who just got pulled over." He let the accusation hang, watching the man's eyes for a crack. "Got something to hide?" This was the move. The implied threat, the suggestion of guilt that hung in the air like a bad smell. It worked on almost everyone. It triggered a flush of anxiety, a stammered denial, a visible tensing of the shoulders, a physical confession of something, even if it was just fear. Elijah Porter's eyes held steady. He didn't lean back, he didn't blink. The faint smile didn't widen, but the intelligence in his gaze seemed to sharpen, focusing on Marshall with a laser-like intensity. "No, officer," he said, his voice a calm, clear pool. Then he paused, and the pause was deliberate, heavy. "Do you?" The three words landed with the quiet force of a seismic shift. They weren't loud, they weren't aggressive, but they carried a simple, devastating question that bypassed the theater of the traffic stop entirely and went straight to the heart of the man conducting it. Marshall's face hardened, his jaw clenching so tight a muscle ticked in his cheek. The words didn't just strike a nerve, they severed it. A hot rush of anger mingled with a shocking jolt of unease flooded his system. How dare he? The arrogance. The sheer, unbelievable gall to turn the question back on him. For a long, suspended second, Marshall couldn't speak. He just stared, his mind scrambling. This wasn't in the manual. This wasn't how people reacted. His authority, the entire edifice of his control in this situation, was built on the premise that his questions were the only ones that mattered. This man had just introduced a new variable into the equation, and Marshall didn't know the formula to solve it. He straightened up, trying to reclaim his looming posture, but the gesture felt hollow now, a pantomime of power. The confidence that had fueled his approach was leaking away, replaced by a simmering, flustered rage. The unshakable man before him was a mirror, and in that mirror, Marshall was beginning to see a disturbing reflection. Not the confident officer of the law, but a man playing a role, and playing it badly against an unimpressed audience. The quiet of the roadside was no longer serene. It was oppressive, charged with the silent battle between Marshall's wilting bluster and Elijah's impregnable calm. The passing cars, which he usually ignored, now felt like witnesses. He was acutely aware of the scene they presented. An officer, tense and red-faced, squared off against a calmly standing man in a suit. He had to regain control. He had to escalate to force a reaction that fit his understanding of the world. The verbal intimidation had failed. The physical presence had failed. There was only one card left to play, the ultimate assertion of his discretionary power. "Step back to the rear of the vehicle," Marshall commanded, his voice rough, betraying his frayed composure. He gestured sharply with his flashlight. The power play had faltered. Now it was time for the search. The order hung in the air like a challenge. Elijah Porter held Officer Marshall's gaze for a heartbeat longer than was comfortable, a silent, pointed acknowledgement of the shift in tactics. Then, without a word, he gave a slow, deliberate nod, not a nod of acquiescence but of permission, as if he were the one allowing the next act to proceed. He walked to the back of the sleek SUV, his movements still unhurried, still graceful. The gravel barely seemed to crunch under his shoes. He stopped a few feet from the tailgate and turned, waiting, his arms now crossed loosely over his chest. It was a posture of observation, not of defense. Marshall followed, the heavy tread of his boots sounding clumsy and loud in comparison. He stopped in front of the tailgate, his hand hovering near the release. He looked at Elijah, expecting a question, a protest, something to feed the narrative of suspicious resistance forming in his mind. "Open it," Marshall said, jerking his chin toward the vehicle. Elijah's head tilted slightly. "Is there a problem with my documents, officer?" His voice was calm, infused now with a tone of genuine, almost academic curiosity. It was the tone of a man trying to understand a flawed process. They were in order, were they not? The question was a trap, a simple, logical trap. If the documents were in order and the violation was a negligible speed infraction, what was the legal basis for a search? Marshall knew the answer, his own discretion. A hunch. the very foundation of his power on this stretch of road, and one that suddenly felt flimsy under the man's polite, penetrating gaze. Marshall's temper, already frayed, snapped. "You seem awfully concerned with my questions," he snapped back, bypassing the legal premise entirely and attacking the man's demeanor. "Just open the trunk." A small, almost imperceptible sigh escaped Elijah's lips. It wasn't a sigh of frustration or fear, but of profound weariness, as if he'd seen this play out too many times to count. He reached into his suit pocket, withdrew a small black key fob and pressed a button. There was a soft, expensive thunk as the latches released, and the tailgate rose silently on its own, revealing the interior. The trunk was a portrait of impeccable order. No junk, no loose tools, no evidence of a chaotic life. On the left, a compact, high-end leather duffel bag, zipped shut. On the right, a hardened leather briefcase, locked. Between them, empty space. It was the trunk of a person who carried only what was necessary and who took care of his possessions. Marshall shouldered past him, his flashlight beam sweeping the pristine cavity as if expecting contraband to materialize under its glare. Finding nothing, he turned his attention to the duffel bag. He unzipped it with a rough pull. Inside, clothes were folded with military precision. Crisp, white dress shirts. A pair of tailored trousers. Underwear and socks in a separate compartment. Everything neat, organized, thoughtful. Marshall began pulling the items out, his hands rough and careless. A perfectly folded shirt was shaken loose, its careful creases destroyed. He rifled through the small personal toiletry kit, holding up a razor, a tube of shaving cream, a bottle of cologne, as if each were a piece of damning evidence. "Traveling for work, huh?" Marshall said, his voice laced with sarcasm. He held up one of the dress shirts, now hopelessly wrinkled. "What kind of work needs a wardrobe like this?" He was digging, scrambling for a narrative. Drug courier, con man. The man's composure had to be a cover for something illicit. Elijah had not moved. He leaned a shoulder against the side of the SUV, watching the violation of his privacy with a detached, analytical calm. When he spoke, his voice was still level, but a new undercurrent had entered it, a steely firmness that had been absent before. "The kind where appearances matter," he replied. Then he paused, letting the next words land with precise weight. "Officer, should I be concerned about the way you're handling my things?" It was another direct question, another refusal to play the role of the chastised suspect. It was a citizen inquiring about the conduct of a public servant. Marshall flinched inwardly. He was creating a mess, literally and figuratively, and the man was calmly pointing it out. Marshall dropped the shirt back into the trunk, a hot blush of anger rising up his neck. He turned to face Elijah fully, dropping any pretense of procedure. "You're awfully bold for someone pulled over on my highway," he sneered, gesturing broadly at the empty road. Elijah's eyebrows lifted. "Your highway," he repeated. His tone was not confrontational, but carried the subtle, devastating weight of genuine curiosity. "I didn't realize Route 29 was privately owned." The correction was polite, surgical, and utterly humiliating. It stripped Marshall's boast of its power, revealing it as the petty territorial claim it was. The officer's pride, the last bastion of his crumbling authority, flared into white-hot rage. He stepped forward, closing the distance until they were almost toe-to-toe, using his physical presence as a final, blunt instrument. "You've got a smart mouth on you," Marshall breathed, his voice low and venomous. That might not work out so well for you. He loomed, waiting for the flinch, the step back, the flicker of fear that would finally restore the natural order. Elijah Porter did not flinch. He did not step back. He held his ground, his gaze locked on Marshall's. And when he spoke, his voice had changed. It was lower now, quieter, but it cut through the air with the clarity of a struck bell. All pretense of the polite, inconvenienced citizen was gone. In its place was a tone of profound, unwavering seriousness. "Officer," he said, the word itself a final warning. "Are you sure you want to keep going down this path?" In that moment, for the first time, Ted Marshall felt a cold, sharp sliver of fear pierce through the fog of his anger. This was not the voice of a man trying to avoid trouble. This was the voice of a man who knew with absolute certainty that the trouble was no longer his to own. The predator's instinct in Marshall, dulled by years of unchallenged dominance, screamed a sudden, silent alarm. He was not the hunter anymore. He was being led, and he had no idea where the path ended. The silence after Elijah Porter's question was thick and electric. The words, "Are you sure you want to keep going down this path?" weren't a plea. They weren't a threat in the crude way Marshall understood threats. They were a final, stark assessment, delivered with the calm of a coroner stating a cause of death. For a fractured second, Officer Marshall stood frozen in that toe-to-toe confrontation, the cold sliver of fear in his gut warring with a lifetime of reflexive arrogance. He broke the standoff, not with words but with a jerky, abrupt turn. His pride wouldn't let him answer the question, but his survival instinct, a new and unfamiliar sensation, pulled him away. He marched back to the driver's side of his patrol car, his movements stiff, leaving Elijah standing by the open, violated trunk. He needed a win. He needed leverage. The man's composure was a fortress, and Marshall, in his frantic state, believed the key to breaching it lay in the dry, digital truth of the computer mounted in his front seat. He slid behind the wheel, the familiar confines of the cruiser feeling suddenly alien, a cockpit for a mission that was veering off course. He could feel Elijah's gaze on his back, patient and heavy. With fingers that felt thick and clumsy, he grabbed the laptop keyboard and began typing in the information from the license he still clutched. Porter Elijah, date of birth, the Richmond address. He hit enter. The system, a sluggish county database, seemed to take an eternity. The spinning wheel of the cursor was a taunt. Marshall stared at the screen, his jaw clenched, rehearsing his next moves. He'd find something, a parking ticket, an old citation, a flag on the vehicle registration, something to carve a crack in that maddening calm. He'd march back over, wave the screen in the man's face and say, This is why. Now we do this my way." The screen refreshed. For a full 3 seconds, Marshall's brain refused to process what he was seeing. The information populated, but it wasn't the sparse data of an ordinary citizen. The fields were fuller. There were flags, but they were not red flags of suspicion. They were gold-encased shields of status. Protected Status Executive Branch scrolled across the top in bold, administrative type. The address wasn't just a Richmond neighborhood. It was listed as secondary residence. The primary residence field read, Virginia Executive Mansion, Richmond. His eyes, scanning frantically, dropped to the special notes section. His blood turned to ice in his veins. Subject, Hun, Elijah Porter. Title, Governor, Commonwealth of Virginia. Security detail, VSB Executive Protection, NON Escort status noted. Priority alert, contact command before any detainment. The words blurred and swam on the screen. Governor, the newly elected governor. The man he just tried to intimidate, whose clothes he'd thrown around, whose character he'd insulted, whose trunk he'd ransacked on a hunch, was the single most powerful person in the state of Virginia. A profound, seismic numbness washed over Ted Marshall. The rushing anger, the flustered pride, the simmering bias, all of it was vaporized in an instant, replaced by a void of pure, unadulterated dread. The air seemed to vanish from the cruiser. He couldn't breathe. He stared through the windshield at the man, who had now closed his trunk with that same infuriating calm and was leaning against the driver's door of the SUV, arms crossed, watching him. Waiting. The predator was gone. The hunter was erased. What sat in the patrol car was a man who had just lit a fuse on his entire career, his pension, his reputation, and possibly his freedom, and he had done it with a smirk and a sense of absolute entitlement. His hands trembled on the keyboard. The priority alert seemed to pulse on the screen, an accusation in blinking text. Contact command before any detainment. He hadn't detained the governor. He'd humiliated him, which was infinitely worse. Through the haze of his shock, he saw Elijah Porter, Governor Porter, push off from his car and begin walking slowly toward the patrol car. There was no aggression in his stride. It was the steady, inevitable approach of judgment. Marshall's body moved on autopilot, a marionette of pure panic. He fumbled with the door handle, spilled out onto the gravel, and straightened up. Every ounce of the imposing posture he'd cultivated was gone. He stood stiff, shoulders hunched, looking like a cadet caught in a monumental error. Elijah stopped a few feet away. The low sun cast a long shadow from the patrol car between them. The governor's expression was unreadable, not angry, not smug. It was contemplative. He studied Marshall's pale, stricken face, the way his hands hung uselessly at his sides. The quiet stretched, each second an agony for the officer. The world had narrowed to this patch of gravel, the two vehicles, and the terrible, yawning chasm of his mistake. Finally, Elijah spoke. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried the full weight of his office. "I take it," Governor Elijah Porter said, "you figured it out by now." It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. And in that moment, Ted Marshall knew that the traffic stop was over. Something else had just begun. The words, "I take it you figured it out by now," hung in the air between them, not as a question but as a simple, devastating statement of fact. Officer Marshall's mouth was dry as ash. He tried to summon a voice, any sound, but his throat had seized. All he could manage was a stiff, jerky nod. The movement felt alien, like a puppet whose strings were being pulled by someone who despised it. "Governor Porter," he stammered. The title tasted foreign and toxic on his tongue. His voice, once a weapon of sharp commands, was now a raspy, hollow thing stripped of all authority. I didn't know." The confession was meant as an excuse, a plea for mitigation. But as soon as he uttered it, he heard its own indictment. "I didn't know." That was the whole terrible point. Elijah didn't respond immediately. He took a slow step forward, closing the short distance. He wasn't looming now. He didn't need to. His power was no longer physical or theatrical. It was absolute, ambient, and it pressed down on Marshall with the gravity of a collapsing star. The governor's eyes, those calm, intelligent pools, scanned Marshall's face. The sheen of cold sweat on his brow, the desperate flicker in his eyes, the way his uniform seemed to hang on him like a sack. "That," Elijah said, his voice still quiet but now laced with a diamond-hard edge, "is painfully obvious." He let the observation sit, allowing Marshall to feel its full weight. The governor then glanced past him toward the open door of the patrol car, the computer screen still undoubtedly glowing with his profile. He looked back at Marshall, his head tilting slightly. "What now, Officer Marshall?" The question was deceptively simple. It was the question Marshall had been asking himself in his spiraling panic. What now? Report. Suspension. A very public, very career-ending inquiry. The humiliation would be absolute. He saw the headlines, the internal affairs interview room, the disgust in his sergeant's eyes. 20 years gone in a 10-minute display of bias and stupidity. But Governor Porter wasn't asking for his plan. He was presenting him with a cliff's edge and asking him to contemplate the drop. The power dynamics hadn't just shifted. They had been inverted, pulverized, and recast. Marshall was no longer an officer of the law conducting a stop. He was a subject awaiting judgment from the head of the executive branch. The man could, with a phone call, unravel his life. Marshall swallowed hard, the sound audible in the quiet. I apologize, sir, profoundly. It was a terrible error in judgment." The words were the right ones, the obsequious ones, but they fell flat, born of fear, not remorse. He was apologizing to the title, not to the man he'd mistreated. Elijah's expression didn't soften. If anything, it grew more focused, more intent. He took another step, and now they were in close conversation, the scene from a distance perhaps looking like two men discussing directions. "Let's talk about what just happened," Elijah said, his tone shifting from verdict to inquest. It was steady, pedagogical. "I complied with every request you made. My documents were in perfect order. I was, by your own thin measure, a few miles per hour over the limit. I broke no laws." He paused, letting the impeccable logic of his conduct settle. "And yet here we are." He gestured with a slight motion of his hand, encompassing the two vehicles, the rumpled clothes in the open trunk, the whole staged drama of the stop. "Tell me why." The command was gentle but immovable. It was the question Marshall had been dreading. He opened his mouth, his mind scrambling for the script. Reasonable suspicion, professional discretion, upholding the law. The phrases felt like sawdust in his brain, meaningless jargon that would crumble under this man's gaze. I was just doing my job," Marshall muttered, the ancient default defense of every overreach in history. But the words were lifeless, and he couldn't even muster the conviction to look Elijah in the eye as he said them. He stared at a point on the governor's impeccably knotted tie. Elijah's eyebrows lifted a fraction, not in anger but in a kind of profound, weary disappointment. It was a more crushing response than any shout could have been. "Your job," Elijah repeated, letting the words hang. "Is that what you call this?" His gaze swept deliberately toward the SUV's trunk again, the visual evidence of the violation. Then his eyes locked back onto Marshall S., pinning him in place. "Tell me, Officer Marshall," he continued, his voice dropping yet losing none of its power. "Do you pull over every car like this, with the theatrics, the trunk search, the careless handling of personal effects, or—" he paused, and the pause was a bottomless pit. "Just the ones where the driver looks like me?" The question was direct, unflinching, and it bypassed all pretense, all protocol to strike at the rotten core of the encounter. It was the question Marshall had spent a career avoiding, even in his own thoughts. His face burned with a shame so acute it felt like a physical sunburn. He couldn't lie. Not to this man, who had seen the entire performance from the front row. He looked down, studying the scuffed toes of his own boots, a pathetic contrast to the polished shoes before him. "I didn't know who you were," he whispered again, a last feeble refuge. Exactly. Elijah's response was swift and sharp as a scalpel. You didn't know who I was, but you assumed I was someone you could treat like this, someone you could dismiss, humiliate, maybe even intimidate. And why? He leaned in the slightest bit, his voice a low, focused force. Because of the way I look, the car I drive. Tell me, Officer Marshall, what was it? There was nowhere to hide. The mirror was held directly in front of him, and the reflection was ugly and undeniable. Marshall's hands clenched into impotent fists at his sides, not in anger, but in a spasm of utter, naked shame. The foundation of his professional identity was cracking apart, and he was free falling through the rubble. He began, but the sentence had no end. There was no answer that wouldn't damn him further. Elijah watched him flounder for a moment longer. Then he did something unexpected. He didn't reach for a phone. He didn't cite a law. He didn't pronounce a punishment. He offered a path, not to salvation, but to something harder, understanding. Officer Marshall's unfinished sentence died in the air, a confession without words. He stood exposed, the architecture of his biases laid bare by Governor Porter's relentless, quiet logic. He waited for the axe to fall, for the cold order to report to his supervisor, for the demand for his badge and gun right there on the shoulder of Route 29. The shame was so complete he almost wished for it, for an end to the excruciating scrutiny. Governor Porter studied him in the heavy silence. He saw the clenched fists, the downcast eyes, the rigid posture of a man braced for a blow. But anger, Marshall realized dimly, was not what filled the governor's expression. It was something more complex, a weary resolve, a sense of profound responsibility that seemed in that moment far heavier than any desire for retribution. Finally, Elijah spoke, his voice cutting through Marshall's spiraling dread. "Save it," he said, his tone firm but lacking malice. He held up a hand not as a threat but as a circuit breaker. "I'm not here to humiliate you, Officer Marshall." The words were so contrary to Marshall's expectations that his head jerked up in confusion. Not to humiliate him. What other point could this entire catastrophic encounter possibly have? Elijah read the confusion on his face. "I'm here to teach you something," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "Whether you learn it or not, that's up to you. Teach him." The concept was alien. In Marshall's world, encounters like this ended with charges, suspensions, or grudging releases, not lessons. Elijah gave a single, slow nod confirming the impossible. "You're going to come with me." It was not a request. It was a directive delivered with the unassailable authority of his office, yet it was not the directive Marshall feared. "There's a community forum tonight," Elijah explained. His voice was matter-of-fact, as if discussing a change of venue for a meeting. "In a neighborhood not far from here, people are gathering to speak, to be heard about the very things we've just acted out here on this road." He paused, letting the connection solidify in Marshall's reeling mind. "You're going to sit there and you're going to listen to the stories of the people you claim to serve." Marshall blinked, his brain struggling to process the sentence. You want me to go to a forum?" The idea was absurd, horrifying, to walk into a room full of them, to sit there in his uniform, a target for every angry, justified glance. "I don't want you to," Elijah corrected, his voice sharpening just enough to slice through the objection. "I'm telling you to, as your governor." The final three words landed with definitive weight. This was not a citizen's suggestion. This was an order from the commander-in-chief of the Virginia State Police, from the man who literally signed his paycheck. Refusal was not an option. It was insubordination of the highest order. Marshall's pride, a wounded, snarling animal, writhed inside him. The thought of being paraded into that room was a deeper humiliation than any disciplinary hearing. A hearing was procedural, private. This would be a public shaming. Yet beneath the roiling pride and fear, something else stirred. A desperate, clawing need for this nightmare to have some point, for his monumental error to not be completely worthless. This path, however terrifying, was being offered instead of destruction. He hesitated, his jaw working. He looked from the governor's impassive face to his own patrol car, the symbol of a life that now felt like a poorly written fiction. "Fine," he grunted, the word ripped from him, devoid of its usual bluster. It was a sound of surrender. Elijah didn't acknowledge the reluctant acceptance with triumph. His expression remained solemn. He stepped closer, not to intimidate, but to ensure his next words were heard clearly, intimately. "This isn't about embarrassing you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more powerful than a shout. "It's about making sure you never do this to anyone else." He let that sink in, his eyes locking onto Marshall's. "Not because you're afraid of who they might be, but because you've learned to respect everyone equally." The words bypassed Marshall's defensive pride and struck something deeper, a dormant chord of the idealism that had led him to put on the badge 2 decades ago. Respect everyone equally. It was the platitude engraved in the academy lobby, a phrase he'd long since filed away as naive. Hearing it now in this context from this man, it felt less like a platitude and more like a devastating indictment of every choice he'd made since. Marshall stared at him. The turmoil inside was a storm, shame, fear, resentment, and a faint, shocking glimmer of something that felt like the beginning of understanding. He gave a stiff, reluctant nod. It was not a commitment but an acknowledgement of the order. "Good," Elijah said, his tone shifting back to one of practical command. He turned and walked toward his SUV. "Follow me. I'll make sure you're seated front and center." Marshall watched the governor slide back into the driver's seat of the black SUV. The engine purred to life, a soft, powerful sound. Slowly, mechanically, Marshall moved back to his patrol car. He fell into the seat, his body numb. He watched Elijah's SUV signal and pull smoothly back onto Route 29. With a trembling hand, Marshall put his own car in drive and followed. The two vehicles moved in a silent, funereal procession away from the site of his professional suicide, toward an unknown room where his personal reckoning was just beginning. The flashing lights were off. The siren was silent. He was no longer the pursuer. He was being led to judgment, and for the first time, Officer Ted Marshall began to dread not the consequence to his career, but the confrontation with his own soul. The procession was short and silent. Officer Marshall followed the governor's SUV off the main highway, down a series of increasingly familiar streets that led into a part of Charlottesville he knew only from patrol logs and crime statistics. The manicured lawns gave way to older, more modest homes, well kept but bearing the quiet weight of time. They pulled into the parking lot of a low, brick community center, its sign weathered but its walkway lined with neat flower beds. A small, earnest crowd was milling outside, talking in hushed, purposeful clusters. Marshall parked his cruiser at the far edge of the lot, putting as much distance between the official vehicle and the people as he could. He killed the engine and sat for a long moment, watching through the windshield. He saw Elijah Porter step out of his SUV. The governor was immediately approached by an older woman who clasped his hands, not with political fervor, but with a kind of weary gratitude. Marshall's uniform, which usually felt like a second skin, now felt like a neon sign blinking guilty. He saw Elijah glance toward his cruiser and give a single, firm nod. The command was clear. The time for hiding in the car was over. Marshall's door groaned as he pushed it open. The sound felt obscenely loud. As his boots hit the asphalt, a few heads turned. Conversations didn't stop, but they lowered, and the glances that flicked his way were not curious or friendly. They were measured, guarded, heavy with a history he had contributed to but never witnessed from this side. His duty belt, with its tools of control, felt like an absurd, cruel costume. Elijah waited at the entrance, holding the door open. Not for him, Marshall realized, but for a young mother maneuvering a stroller. The governor then stood aside, his gaze finding Marshall's, and gestured with his chin for him to enter. There was no smugness in the gesture. It was the calm instruction of a guide leading a visitor into a sacred, painful space. The hum inside was different from the quiet outside. It was a low thrum of contained emotion, frustration, hope, weary resolve. The room was a simple gymnasium with a raised stage at one end and rows of folding chairs facing it, most of them filled. The air was warm, close, smelling of old coffee and floor polish. Elijah led the way down the center aisle. Every step was an agony of exposure. Marshall felt hundreds of eyes on his back, a physical pressure. He heard the whispers rise and then fall in their wake. He kept his gaze fixed on the scuffed heels of the governor's shoes, a lifeline in a sea of silent judgment. They reached the front row. Two empty chairs waited, conspicuously reserved. Elijah motioned for him to take the one on the aisle. Marshall sat, his back rigid, his hands planted on his knees to stop them from shaking. He stared straight ahead at the empty microphone stand on the stage, a minimalist monument to voices about to be amplified. Elijah did not sit. He walked up the short steps to the stage and approached the microphone. A respectful hush settled over the room, immediate and complete. This was not the silence of an audience waiting for a speech. It was the silence of people who had been waiting for a very long time to be heard. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elijah began, his voice steady and clear, needing no amplifier to fill the space. "Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for trusting this space with your stories." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, connecting with individuals in the crowd. "This forum exists for one simple reason: your voices matter." But too often, those in positions of power, we forget to listen. We get insulated, we make assumptions. His gaze, deliberate and unhurried, drifted to the front row to the man in the uniform. Marshall felt it like a laser point on his skin. Every person in the room followed the governor's glance. The weight of their collective attention was a physical force, pressing him down into the flimsy folding chair. "Tonight," Elijah continued, his voice softening but gaining intensity, "we're here to listen, to learn and to grow, and that commitment includes me and others who have sworn to serve this community." He stepped back from the mic with a slight nod. The moderator, a local pastor, stood and invited the first speaker. A middle-aged woman walked to the stage. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the microphone down to her height. She took a deep, shaky breath. "My son," she began, her voice cracking on the first word. She cleared her throat, forced strength into it. "My son was pulled over last year. He was 17, just got his driver's license." She looked not at the crowd, but at some middle distance, seeing the memory. The officer said his tail light was out, but we checked it the next day. It was. A tear traced a path down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. He was so scared. He called me from the car, whispering. He was afraid to even reach for his registration. He kept saying, "Mom, I don't want to move. What if he thinks I'm reaching for something?" Her voice broke completely then. "He's a kid. He just wanted to come home." Marshall's throat constricted. He stared at his hands. He had used the tail light excuse. Dozens of times, a young man followed. He spoke of being frisked against his own car while walking home from his job at a grocery store, still in his apron, because he fit a description of someone seen blocks away. The description was black male, hoodie, the young man said, a bitter laugh escaping him. It was 50 degrees out. Half the neighborhood fit that description. An elderly man, his voice reed thin but fierce, spoke of the fear that gripped him every time his grandsons, bright young men with college futures, left the house at night. "I pray they just come home," he said. "Not because of cars or crime, but because of the cars with the lights." A teenage girl, her braces glinting under the lights, described being followed by a patrol car for 3 blocks as she walked to her babysitting job in a nicer neighborhood, only to have the officer roll down his window and ask, "You live around here?" With each story delivered not with shouted anger but with exhausted, heart-breaking clarity, Marshall felt the walls inside him crumble. These weren't statistics or community relations issues from a briefing. These were people. With names, with faces, with mothers and grandfathers and dreams. And their pain was a direct, unbroken line from policies and attitudes to him, to his smirk in the patrol car, to his habitual tap-tap on the trunk, to his searching hands in a duffel bag. He sat in the front row, in the uniform that marked him as part of the system that had inflicted these wounds, and he finally began to understand the cost. The shame he felt was no longer just for his career. It was a deeper, more terrifying shame for the damage done, for the fear sown, for the simple, daily dignity he and others like him had stolen. One traffic stop, one preventative frisk, one suspicious glance at a time. The governor had not brought him here to punish him. He had brought him here to make him see. And for the first time, through a haze of profound discomfort, Ted Marshall was truly beginning to look. The testimonies were a river of pain, flowing from the stage and flooding the room, each story carving its own channel through the bedrock of Marshall's assumptions. He sat motionless, a statue of blue and beige in the front row, absorbing it all. The room was thick with a shared, heavy truth, not of isolated incidents, but of a pattern, a lived experience he had been an agent of but had never been forced to witness from this side of the badge. Then, a shift. A final speaker was called, but instead of an adult walking to the stage, a small figure slipped from a middle row seat. It was a boy, no older than 10, wearing a clean basketball jersey and jeans that were slightly too big. He approached the microphone with a solemnity that belied his years, his sneakers whispering on the wooden stage. He had to stretch to pull the mic down, the stand squeaking in protest. A soft, collective inhale passed through the crowd. The moderator moved as if to help, but the boy shook his head, a tiny gesture of fierce independence. He gripped the stand with both small hands, his knuckles white. He looked out at the sea of faces, his own young face a mask of nervous courage. "My dad," he began, his voice high and clear, cutting through the weighted atmosphere. It didn't crack. It was pure, unadulterated childhood, asking a question far older than he was. My dad tells me to always be polite to police. To say yes, sir, and no, sir, to keep my hands where they can see them. He paused, his brow furrowing slightly as he wrestled with the complexity of the lesson. The room was utterly silent, hanging on every syllable. But sometimes, he continued, his voice dipping just a little, I think, even if I'm polite, they won't like me anyway. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. Is that true? The question, delivered with the devastating simplicity of a child, hung in the air. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't angry. It was a genuine, painful quest for knowledge. Is the world this way? Is the thing I am taught to do, to be good, to be polite, enough to keep me safe in my own skin? The silence that followed was deafening, profound. It was the sound of a room full of adults who knew the brutal, complicated answer but couldn't bear to give it to this child on the stage. It was the sound of Marshall's own heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, shameful drum. That question was the destination of every story told that night. It was the seed of fear planted by the mother's son whispering in the car. It was the root of the grandfather's nightly prayers. It was the quiet terror behind the teenage girl's frustration. It was the product of 1,000 officer marshals. The boy, receiving no answer, gave a small, confused nod to himself, as if he'd expected the silence. He let go of the microphone and walked back to his seat, disappearing into the safety of his family. The spell was broken, but the question remained, vibrating in the very air. Governor Elijah Porter returned to the stage. His usual composure seemed thinner, his eyes glistening with a sheen of moisture he did not wipe away. He placed his hands on the sides of the podium and looked out, his gaze finding Marshall's and holding it for a suspended moment before sweeping the room. This, Elijah said, his voice thick with emotion he made no effort to hide, is why we're here. He gestured toward the empty space where the boy had stood. To face the hard truths, to own up to the damage that's been done, and to make sure the next generation doesn't have to grow up thinking that respect is a one-way street, that their politeness is a currency that might not be accepted. He took a deep breath, seeming to gather himself. Then he turned his body slightly, his focus narrowing to the front row. Officer Marshall, he said, his tone not commanding but inviting. Would you like to say something? Every eye in the room, still swimming with the echo of the boy's question, swiveled to him. The pressure was astronomical, a physical force pushing down on his shoulders. For a long, paralyzed moment, he couldn't move. He was a bug in a jar, pinned by the collective gaze of the community he had failed. The old marshal would have clammed up, hardened, hidden behind the badge. But the old marshal had been dismantled piece by piece on the roadside and then dissolved completely in the river of stories. That man was gone. What was left was raw, exposed, and trembling. Slowly, as if against immense gravity, he rose to his feet. The folding chair scraped loudly on the floor. He adjusted his belt, a habitual gesture that now felt meaningless. He cleared his throat, the sound a dry rasp in the quiet. He forced his eyes up from the floor. He looked at the mother who had spoken first, her face still streaked with tears. He looked at the young man in the imaginary apron, at the weary grandfather, at the brave teenage girl. He did not look at the governor. He began, his voice rough, unfamiliar to his own ears. It broke. He swallowed, tried again. I've spent 20 years thinking I was doing my job the right way, thinking I was enforcing the law. He paused, the words feeling like lies even as he said them. He shook his head, a small, desperate motion. But tonight I realize I've been enforcing my own bias instead. The admission, spoken aloud in this room to these people, was the most difficult thing he had ever done. It felt like tearing out a part of his own identity and laying it on the floor for them to see. And for that, he continued, his voice gaining a shred of strength from the sheer truth of it, I am sorry. He let the word hang. Sorry was so inadequate, a thimble trying to bail out an ocean, but it was all he had. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't expect trust overnight. He finally risked a glance at Elijah, who gave him the faintest, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't approval, it was acknowledgement. Keep going. Marshall looked back at the crowd, meeting their guarded, weary eyes. But I promise you this, he said, and the promise felt like a vow forged in the furnace of his shame. I'm going to do better. I'll start by listening, by learning, and by making sure my actions reflect the respect every one of you deserves. He stopped. There was nothing else, no defense, no excuse, just a broken promise and a fledgling, trembling new one. The room was silent for a beat that felt like an eternity. Then from the back, a single, slow clap, then another. It was the mother. Then the young man joined. Then the pastor. The applause wasn't thunderous or celebratory. It was measured, heavy, acknowledging not an achievement but a beginning. A necessary, painful first step. Marshall's throat tightened, but this time it wasn't from shame or fear. It was from something else, something fragile and long forgotten, cutting through the wreckage inside him. It felt, for the first time in 20 years, like a sliver of hope. The measured applause faded, leaving a resonant quiet in the community center. The forum was over, but the energy it had unleashed lingered, a tangible hum in the warm air. People rose slowly, gathering coats, speaking in low, thoughtful tones as they filed out. Officer Marshall remained in his front row seat, staring at his hands, the hands that had rummaged through a governor's luggage, that had tapped on countless trunks, that had held a flashlight like a weapon of scrutiny. They looked like foreign objects to him now. He heard the soft footsteps on the gym floor before he saw the polished shoes stop beside his chair. He looked up. Governor Elijah Porter stood there, his expression unreadable in the dimming house lights. You did something tonight, Elijah said, his voice quiet, that many people never get the chance to do. He paused, letting the statement settle. You admitted you were wrong, in front of the people you wronged. That's the first step. Marshall nodded slowly, the movement heavy. The catharsis of the moment had passed, leaving behind the stark, daunting landscape of what came next. It doesn't feel like a step, he murmured, his voice rough. It feels like the ground disappeared. I don't even know where to begin. Elijah pulled a chair from the row and sat beside him, not as a governor to a subordinate, but as one man who had witnessed something to another. The simple act of sitting, of sharing the level space, was its own kind of communication. You start, Elijah said, by showing up. He looked around the emptying room. Not just here, but everywhere you're needed, at the next forum, at the neighborhood watch meeting in the community you've only ever patrolled. At the youth center, you show up to listen, you show up to learn, you show up to change. His eyes found Marshall S. again, earnest and intense. That's how you earn trust, not with words in a moment of pressure, with actions day after day. The simplicity of it was staggering. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic penance. It was about presence. The one thing his authority had never required of him before, vulnerable, listening presence. I want to be better, Marshall said, the words a raw whisper, the truest thing he'd uttered all night. Elijah studied him for a long moment, then a faint, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but of recognition. "Then be better," he said softly. "It's as simple and as hard as that." They rose together and walked out into the cool night air. The parking lot was nearly empty. Marshall felt strangely lighter, as if the confession had physically unburdened him, though the path ahead still seemed impossibly long and steep. Elijah paused by his SUV, the vehicle that had started it all. He turned, his face illuminated by the lone security light overhead. "You know," Elijah said, a reflective note in his voice, "people like you're the reason I ran for office." He held up a hand before Marshall could misunderstand. Not to punish, but to change things, to create moments where a different outcome is possible. "I believe people can learn." He met Marshall's gaze directly. "Even you, Officer Marshall." Marshall let out a soft, dry chuckle, a sound devoid of any real humor. It was the laugh of a man seeing the absurd, painful truth of his own life. "I guess I've got a lot of learning to do." "We all do," Elijah replied. He opened his car door but paused, one last thought holding him. "This isn't just about you, though. Remember that. It's about the boy who asked the question. It's about his father who teaches him politeness as a shield. It's about every person in that room tonight. It's about the people you serve. Never forget that." With a final nod, Elijah Porter got into his car and drove away. The red taillights dwindled into the darkness, leaving Marshall alone in the quiet parking lot. He stood there for a long time, not as a man enforcing the law, but as a man learning for the first time what the law was truly meant to serve. The next day, Marshall returned to work. Tucked into the breast pocket of his uniform over his heart was a small, black notebook. When a call came in about a dispute between neighbors in Oak Creek Gardens, a neighborhood he'd only ever entered with sirens, he volunteered. He listened more than he spoke. He heard about the overhanging tree, the noisy dog, but also about the fear of property values, the stress of 2 jobs, the hope for safer streets. He took notes. He sought out the community liaison officer, a position he'd previously ridiculed as social work. He asked for the schedule of meetings. That Thursday, he sat in the back of a library meeting room for a Bridging the Divide dialogue, his uniform the only one in the room. He didn't speak. He just listened to the frustration, the ideas, the desperate desire for partnership. The stories from the forum played on a loop in his mind, a soundtrack of conscience. The mother's tears, the grandfather's prayer, the young man's bitter laugh, and always the clear, high voice of the boy. Is that true? Months later, in the quiet of the Virginia Executive Mansion, Governor Elijah Porter sat at his desk. Among the formal correspondence and policy briefs was a simple, hand-addressed envelope. He opened it. Inside was a photograph of a diverse group of people sitting around a table in a community center. A banner behind them read Charlottesville Community Police Relations Board Inaugural Meeting. In the front row, in a button-down shirt instead of a uniform, sat Ted Marshall. He was not leading. He was listening, his body angled toward an elderly woman who was speaking. Beneath the photo was a handwritten note. "Governor Porter, I'm still learning. I expect I always will be. But I'm showing up." Attached is proof of the first meeting of a board I proposed and helped form. It's not much, but it's a start. Thank you for giving me the chance to see things differently. Respectfully, Ted Marshall. Elijah smiled, a deep, weary, hopeful smile. He leaned back in his chair, the letter held lightly in his fingers. His thoughts drifted to the forum, to the small boy on the stage, his earnest face illuminated by the single spotlight. Is that true? The answer was still complicated. It would be for a long time. Systems were slow to change. Hearts were slower. But the photo on his desk, the weight of the note, was a spark in that complexity. It was evidence that a moment of confrontation could become a catalyst for change. That acknowledgement could fertilize the ground for action. Someday, he thought, putting the letter down carefully on the polished wood. Someday, perhaps, a child wouldn't have to ask that question. Someday, respect wouldn't have to be a strategy for safety, earned through fear or demanded through power. It would simply be given freely because it was right, because people had learned to see each other, not as threats or stereotypes, but as human beings. The story of Governor Elijah Porter and Officer Ted Marshall is a reminder that change never begins with perfection. It begins, always, with a painful, honest look in the mirror. It grows not from revenge, but from the harder, braver path of redemption. It is forged in the quiet decision to show up, to listen, and to choose every day to be better.